The records do not mention their names often. When they do, the references are brief, administrative, and careful. Entries folded into property ledgers, estate inventories, and correspondence that never expected to be read with moral curiosity. Yet in the spring of 1847, on a broad stretch of land outside Milledgeville, Georgia, two sisters lived lives that quietly unsettled the structure around them. They were twins by birth, raised within the same walls, taught the same lessons, and groomed for the same future. What separated them was not temperament or belief, but timing, the precise moment when they each realized that obedience did not require agreement. The estate itself was unremarkable by the standards of the region. Cotton fields stretched outward in measured rows, bordered by pine and red clay roads. The main house sat elevated on brick piers, its white columns already yellowing from age. Behind it lay the quarters, kitchens, smokehouses, and barns that supported a system whose efficiency depended on routine and silence. Nothing in the layout suggested instability. The appearance of order was complete. The twins were born into this order. Their father, a landowner of modest prominence, valued discipline and continuity. He believed systems endured not because they were just, but because they were predictable. From childhood, the sisters learned how to manage a household, how to read accounts, how to supervise labor without appearing involved in it. They were not taught cruelty, but they were taught distance. That, he believed, was the difference between command and chaos. After his death, the estate passed jointly to the sisters, as no sons had survived childhood. This detail was noted with some surprise among neighbors, but not concern. Women had managed plantations before. What mattered was that the system remained intact, that the flow of production, control, and hierarchy did not falter. For a time it did not. The twins divided responsibilities naturally. One handled correspondence and trade. The other oversaw domestic operations and field supervision. Their unity reassured overseers and neighboring families alike. Decisions were made efficiently. Discipline was consistent. No debts accrued. From the outside, the estate appeared even more stable than before. But stability can conceal motion. The enslaved population on the estate was large enough to require constant management, yet small enough that patterns were easily noticed. Births were recorded. Deaths were accounted for. Skills were tracked. Over time, certain observations began to surface quietly, among overseers, among visiting relatives, and eventually within the sisters' own awareness. Some children born on the estate did not resemble others. This was not unprecedented in Georgia. Such occurrences were often explained away, discussed in low voices, or deliberately misunderstood. The accepted response was silence. Silence preserved order. Silence preserved reputations. The twins were raised to understand this rule. What made their situation different was proximity. They knew every birth. They read every entry. They saw the children grow, not as abstractions but as daily presences. And because they worked together, they shared observations without the protective filter of denial. The realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as accumulation. There were children whose features did not align with the narratives written for them. Children whose position in the hierarchy required careful adjustment. Children whose existence required quiet explanations. Over time, these explanations grew thin. The sisters did not speak of this to anyone else. They did not ask questions publicly. They did not disrupt the visible order of the estate. But privately something shifted. Not outrage. Not rebellion. Awareness. The system they inherited depended on strict separations, between owner and enslaved, between household and field, between authority and vulnerability. What they began to see suggested that these separations were already compromised. Not by resistance, but by behavior long accepted as tradition. In letters from the period, one sister wrote of inheritance, not as property but as burden. The word appears in passing, embedded within practical discussions of yields and repairs. Yet its tone is unmistakable. Inheritance, for her, meant responsibility for a structure whose moral architecture had been eroding long before it reached her hands. Their private choice did not announce itself as defiance. It emerged instead as restraint. They did not formalize relationships. They did not issue declarations. What they did was simpler, and therefore more dangerous. They refused to participate in the quiet perpetuation of certain practices. They chose distance where tradition expected indulgence. They chose limits where custom relied on access. This decision required coordination. The twins spoke at night in rooms closed to servants and overseers alike. They compared memories, cross-referenced patterns, and tested assumptions. Each conversation stripped another layer of inevitability from what they had been taught to accept. They did not imagine themselves as reformers. They understood too well how fragile their authority was. They were women in a system that tolerated their control only as long as it functioned smoothly. Any disruption would be attributed not to moral conviction, but to incompetence. So they acted quietly. Access was reduced. Certain arrangements were altered under the guise of efficiency. Supervisory roles were reassigned. Movements within the estate were adjusted, not to provoke resistance but to limit opportunity. These changes were subtle enough to escape immediate scrutiny, yet deliberate enough to matter. The enslaved population noticed before anyone else did. Silence changes texture when its meaning shifts. What had once been an imposed quiet began to feel different, less absolute, less resigned. The absence of certain behaviors created space for interpretation. People noticed who no longer appeared where they once had. They noticed which boundaries were suddenly enforced. No one spoke of it openly. But awareness travels without language. The overseer, an older man accustomed to routine, mentioned in passing that things felt different. He could not explain how. Productivity remained steady. Discipline required no increase. Yet something about the atmosphere resisted his expectations. The twins listened. They recorded. They adjusted again. What they were doing did not dismantle the system. They knew this. The structure was too vast, too reinforced by law and belief. But they were learning that systems do not require collapse to be challenged. Sometimes they only require interruption. The risk lay not in what they were preventing but in what their prevention revealed. Neighbors began to notice fewer incidents that had once been quietly understood. Visits grew more cautious. Conversations shifted. Questions emerged, not accusations but curiosity. Why were certain arrangements no longer tolerated? Why had routines changed? The twins answered carefully. Efficiency. Order. Moral responsibility framed as management. These explanations were sufficient, for a time. But systems built on silence react poorly when silence is redefined. What had once protected reputations now threatened them. The absence of expected behavior became its own kind of evidence. By late summer, correspondence from distant relatives hinted at concern. Not outrage but unease. The sisters were advised, gently, to remember tradition. To avoid attracting attention. To maintain appearances. They understood the warning. Their choice had already begun to alter the estate's internal logic. Authority was still exercised but it no longer operated invisibly. Boundaries once assumed had been named, if only privately. And once named they could not be fully erased. The twins stood at an uncertain threshold. They had not declared opposition. They had not aligned themselves with abolitionist movements or public dissent. Yet they had intervened in the most intimate mechanism of the system, the way power reproduced itself quietly, generation after generation. They knew consequences would follow. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. The plantation still functioned. The fields still yielded. The ledgers remained balanced. From the outside, nothing appeared altered. Inside, however, understanding had taken root. And understanding, once shared, even between just two people, has a way of expanding beyond intention. As autumn approached, the sisters faced a question they had so far avoided. How long restraint could remain invisible, and what would happen when their private choice encountered public expectation? They did not yet know the answer. But the estate was already changing in ways no ledger could record. The first changes were felt where records were never kept. They appeared not in ledgers or correspondence, but in routines, in the way days unfolded, in the spaces people occupied, and in the expectations that quietly governed them. On the Georgia estate, restraint did not announce itself as policy. It arrived as absence. Certain doors were no longer opened. Certain summons were no longer issued. Certain assumptions lost their certainty. For the enslaved women, this absence was unsettling at first. Silence had always been dangerous, but it had also been predictable. When silence changed shape, it demanded attention. They noticed it during night hours first. The sounds that once marked interruption, footsteps, whispered instructions, the opening of doors, became less frequent. The quarters did not become safer in any formal sense. Authority still existed. Punishment was still possible. But the pattern that had governed vulnerability was no longer consistent. Women who had learned to prepare themselves for inevitability began instead to prepare for uncertainty. Uncertainty, unlike inevitability, invites thought. No one spoke openly about the change. To do so would have been reckless. Instead, women observed one another. They measured the difference between rumor and experience. They compared nights, compared expectations, compared the tone of oversight during the day. A woman who had lived on the estate for more than 20 years later described this period simply as the pause. She could not explain why it happened or how long it lasted. She only knew that for the first time since her arrival, what had always been assumed stopped arriving on schedule. The twins did not see this woman's observation. They did not hear her words. Yet their restraint had created it. During the day, the sisters' authority remained unchanged. They inspected work, approved repairs, managed trade. They spoke little, but when they did, their words carried consistency. There was no visible disagreement between them. This unity mattered. It insulated their decisions from suspicion. But it also meant that restraint was no longer individual, it was institutional, however quietly so. Children, too, felt the shift before they understood it. The youngest noticed only that certain adults appeared less burdened, less withdrawn. Older children noticed something else, that the stories they had been told to explain their own existence were no longer reinforced by daily behavior. A boy whose skin was lighter than his mother's once asked why he was not assigned indoor work, as others like him had been. No one answered directly. But the question itself was new. It suggested that children were beginning to compare narratives with reality, and finding gaps. These gaps mattered. Belief on the plantation had always been managed through repetition. Stories were not meant to convince, they were meant to exhaust inquiry. When repetition faltered, inquiry returned. The twins sensed this shift only indirectly. They noticed fewer conflicts rooted in resentment and fewer attempts to negotiate through proximity. Requests changed tone. They became more formal, more careful. People began to test boundaries not through defiance, but through patience. This was not obedience as submission. It was obedience as assessment. The sisters responded cautiously. They did not reward curiosity. They did not punish it either. Their authority became less reactive and more procedural. Rules were applied evenly. Exceptions became rare. From the perspective of management, this appeared as efficiency. From the perspective of those living under it, it appeared as structure without intrusion. The difference was subtle but profound. One of the twins wrote to a cousin during this period, describing the estate as unusually quiet. She attributed it to the season, to routine, to maturity among the labor force. But the language she used betrayed something else. She spoke of calm not as control but as distance. She described herself as less involved, a phrase that would have alarmed anyone who understood the system's dependence on involvement of a certain kind. Distance had always been a privilege of authority. Now it was being redistributed. The women in the quarters did not interpret this change as benevolence. They were too experienced for that. Instead, they interpreted it as information. Something had shifted above them. The rules had not disappeared, but they were being enforced differently. That difference opened a narrow space for choice. Not rebellion. Not escape. Choice of another kind. The choice to observe rather than anticipate, to endure without rehearsing fear in advance. This altered posture spread quietly. Women who had once spoken only in whispers began speaking less, but listening more. They began to mark which behaviors provoked attention and which did not. They began to recognize patterns of absence as deliberately maintained rather than accidental. Understanding formed slowly like sediment. It was not understanding of justice or injustice. Those concepts were too distant, too abstract. It was understanding of leverage, of where power was exercised and where it was withheld. And withheld power is still power. The twins, for their part, were confronting a parallel realization. Restraint, they learned, was not passive. It required vigilance. Each boundary they enforced generated questions. Each absence demanded explanation. They found themselves spending more time justifying what they were not doing than what they were. This created pressure from unexpected quarters. Visitors commented on the estate's unusual order. A neighbor remarked that things seemed calmer than necessary, a phrase meant as praise but delivered with suspicion. Another suggested that too much distance bred disrespect. The sisters listened without argument. They adjusted nothing. Their belief was shifting too. They had grown up believing that the system's cruelty was inseparable from its function. That without certain transgressions, productivity would falter. That without access, authority would weaken. Yet the estate continued to function. Fields were tended. Harvests met expectation. No organized resistance emerged. If anything, compliance increased, not from fear but from predictability. This unsettled the sisters more than defiance would have. If restraint did not destroy the system, then the system had never required the practices they had been taught to accept. This implication challenged not only tradition, but inheritance itself. They began to understand that what had been framed as necessity was, in fact, choice, repeated so often it had become invisible. This realization carried weight. It meant that their father's generation and those before him had not been trapped by circumstance. They had acted deliberately. The twins did not share this conclusion with each other immediately. It arrived differently for each of them. One approached it intellectually as a problem of structure and efficiency. The other approached it emotionally as a reckoning with responsibility. Together, these approaches formed a fragile alignment. Meanwhile, among the enslaved population, belief was shifting in a different direction. People began to understand that silence could be strategic. That what was not demanded might not need to be surrendered. That survival did not always require compliance beyond what was visibly enforced. This was not hope. It was calibration. A woman who had long managed to avoid attention by making herself indispensable began refusing certain requests. Not openly, but through delay, through redirection, through adherence to formal rules. When nothing happened in response, others noticed. The system did not react because it did not recognize the action as resistance. That was its weakness. Restraint, practiced quietly by those in power, had created space for restraint among those without it. Silence, once imposed, was becoming shared, but not equally. Its meaning was changing. The overseer sensed this and grew uneasy. He reported nothing concrete, only a feeling that control was becoming abstract. The sisters thanked him and took no action. Their inaction was itself inaction. By winter, the estate had entered a new rhythm. It was not kinder. It was not freer. But it was less intimate. The boundaries between authority and vulnerability were clearer, not because they were enforced brutally but because they were acknowledged. This clarity threatened the system more than chaos ever could. Belief had begun to shift, among the enslaved, among the overseer, and among the twins themselves. Belief that certain things were inevitable. Belief that tradition equaled necessity. Belief that silence meant consent. None of these beliefs collapsed dramatically. They thinned. They weakened. They became negotiable. And when belief becomes negotiable, behavior follows. The twins could feel pressure building, not from rebellion but from expectation. Their restraint had altered the estate's internal logic. It was only a matter of time before that alteration demanded response. They did not yet know whether they would be required to retreat, to justify, or to escalate. They only knew that restraint had carried them to a point beyond neutrality. Understanding had altered behavior. Now it was beginning to alter belief. And belief, once changed, rarely stays contained. Understanding does not move quickly in places built to prevent it. On the Georgia estate, knowledge had always been compartmentalized. Each household, each work group, each individual carried only what was necessary to survive the day. Curiosity beyond that was discouraged not just by punishment but by exhaustion. People learned early that asking too much cost more than it offered. But once belief begins to loosen, understanding does not need encouragement. It needs only space. That space had been created quietly, by restraint, by distance, by the absence of certain intrusions that once stitched fear into daily life. What had first been felt as an anomaly began to feel, over time, like a condition. And conditions, once normalized, shape behavior. The shift was not announced. It did not spread as a rumor or a warning. It spread as comparison. A woman noticed that her sister, working in a different quarter, experienced the same absence she did. A man assigned to field labor observed that indoor assignments no longer carried the same unspoken implications they once had. Children compared notes without language precise enough to name what they were sensing, but clear enough to recognize difference. Silence, long understood as something imposed, was being reconsidered as something managed. This did not mean people spoke more. In fact, they often spoke less. Words were risk. Observation was safer. Understanding moved through glances, pauses, and decisions not made. Women began to adjust their routines subtly. They delayed certain tasks until daylight. They sought work assignments that had once been avoided, not because the labor was easier, but because the environment had changed. They began to recognize that proximity no longer guaranteed vulnerability. This recalibration was cautious. No one assumed permanence. But even temporary shifts matter in systems built on inevitability. The overseer noticed patterns before he understood causes. Productivity remained steady, but compliance felt different. Instructions were followed precisely, sometimes too precisely. Requests that had once been met with unspoken negotiation were now met with formal adherence. It was difficult to discipline someone who did exactly what was asked. This unsettled him. Control had always relied on ambiguity, on the ability to reinterpret rules depending on circumstance, on access that could not be named but was always implied. Now implication was being stripped away. The overseer reported again to the twins, this time with more specificity. He described a workforce that was technically compliant but oddly resistant. He could not point to rebellion. He could not justify punishment. He could only describe a loss of flexibility. The sisters listened. They asked questions. They changed nothing. What they were witnessing was not defiance, it was adaptation. Understanding had moved beyond individuals and into pattern. Among the enslaved population, a quiet consensus was forming, not articulated but sensed. Silence no longer meant surrender. Silence could be used. It could be timed. It could be shared. This realization altered how people evaluated risk. They began to test the edges of expectation, not by pushing outward but by pulling inward, by withholding what had once been given automatically. A woman known for anticipating needs stopped doing so. A man who had once volunteered for extra duties waited to be asked. When no consequences followed, others noticed. This was not resistance in the traditional sense. It did not seek to disrupt output. It sought to disrupt assumption. Assumption had been the system's most reliable tool. The twins, meanwhile, were confronting a parallel diffusion of understanding within their own circles. Word of their estate's unusual order traveled outward, not as accusation but as curiosity. Other landowners asked questions masked as compliments. Clergy members remarked on discipline achieved without severity. These remarks forced the sisters to articulate positions they had never formalized. They found themselves defending restraint not as morality but as management, not as reform but as efficiency. This framing protected them, but it also revealed the fragility of tradition. If restraint required defense, then tradition was no longer self-justifying. Within the household, staff adapted as well. Domestic workers observed fewer contradictions between spoken rules and enforced behavior. The predictability made certain roles less volatile. This steadiness allowed information to travel more easily, from kitchen to quarters, from quarters to fields. Understanding rarely travels alone. It carries permission. Permission to observe. Permission to compare. Permission to imagine alternatives, however limited. No one imagined freedom. That concept remained too distant, too dangerous. But they imagined difference. They imagined continuity without intrusion. They imagined survival without constant negotiation of vulnerability. These imaginings mattered. The estate began to develop an internal rhythm distinct from others nearby. Visitors noticed it without understanding it. They described it as orderly, quiet, efficient. None of these words captured the tension beneath the surface, because the system was no longer held together solely by fear. Fear still existed, but it was no longer the only organizing force. This destabilized authority more than open rebellion would have. The twins began to feel the limits of their own position. Their private choice had reshaped behavior beyond what they could monitor. They had not intended to inspire adaptation. They had intended only to withdraw participation from certain practices. Yet withdrawal had consequences. Their father's legacy loomed in absence. They inherited not only land and labor, but expectation. The expectation that authority would be exercised fully, that nothing would be left unused. Restraint, once established, demanded justification. Neighbors speculated. Overseers questioned. Distant relatives hinted at concern. Each inquiry narrowed the margin in which the twins could operate quietly. At the same time, the estate's internal cohesion strengthened, not in loyalty to the sisters, but in shared understanding among those subjected to the system. People began to recognize that power, when predictable, could be navigated. Predictability reduces fear. Reduced fear encourages calculation. Calculation in turn creates leverage. The system reacted as systems do when their assumptions are challenged, by seeking visibility. The overseer increased inspections. He demanded clearer reports. He walked the grounds more frequently. He watched interactions more closely. But visibility exposed something uncomfortable. There was no single point of failure. No leader to discipline. No conspiracy to uncover. The change was distributed, embedded in routine, reinforced by absence. Punishment, applied without justification, risked disrupting the efficiency that outsiders now praised. Authority hesitated. That hesitation was felt. People adjusted again. They did not push further. They simply held their position. They waited. Understanding had traveled far enough to create expectation, but not far enough to provoke open confrontation. Yet the system could not remain in this suspended state indefinitely. Silence, once private, was now collective. And collective silence carries meaning. The twins sensed that their choice had moved beyond their control. What had begun as a personal boundary had become a structural condition. They faced a narrowing set of options: retreat and restore the old order, escalate through force, or formalize restraint into something recognizable, and therefore challengeable. Each option carried risk. They had delayed this reckoning by remaining quiet. But quiet had begun to speak. Across the estate, people were watching, not for permission but for reaction. They understood now that what mattered was not intention but response. Understanding had traveled. It had reshaped behavior. It had altered belief. The question was no longer whether the system had changed. It was how it would respond to having been changed without being asked. When control becomes visible, systems rarely announce when they feel threatened. They respond by tightening. On the Georgia estate, the shift came quietly but decisively. The change was not framed as punishment or reform. It was presented as clarification of roles, of rules, of authority. What had once been implied would now be made visible. Visibility, the plantation believed, would restore certainty. The overseer was instructed to increase presence, not merely to observe but to be seen observing. Paths were walked more frequently. Work was checked more closely. Conversations that had once passed without notice were now interrupted by proximity alone. Nothing was said outright. Orders were delivered calmly. Discipline, when applied, was procedural rather than dramatic. This was important. Force that draws attention risks explanation. Force delivered as routine presents itself as inevitability. Yet inevitability had already been weakened. Those subjected to this renewed visibility understood its purpose immediately, not because it was effective but because it was familiar. They had lived through cycles like this before. Increased oversight always followed moments when authority felt uncertain. What was different now was how people responded. They did not retreat into fear as expected. Instead, they adjusted their calculations. Work was performed carefully. Rules were followed precisely. There was no overt resistance to provoke escalation. But the internal posture had changed. People no longer interpreted visibility as omnipotence. They interpreted it as effort. Effort implies limitation. The overseer, accustomed to compliance driven by anticipation, now encountered compliance driven by observation. He could correct actions but not attitudes. He could enforce rules but not restore the assumptions that once gave those rules weight. This frustrated him more than defiance ever had. He reported that people were behaving correctly without behaving properly, a phrase that unsettled the twins. They understood what he meant. The estate was functioning, but it no longer felt obedient in the way tradition demanded. To the sisters, this moment clarified something they had been resisting. Their restraint had not softened authority, it had exposed its mechanisms. By withdrawing from certain practices, they had revealed which aspects of control were essential and which had merely been customary. Now, the plantation was attempting to reclaim the latter as if they were the former. Discipline followed. Not indiscriminately but symbolically. A handful of individuals were corrected publicly for minor infractions. The intent was not punishment but demonstration. Demonstration relies on belief. But belief no longer traveled uniformly. Those who witnessed these moments did not interpret them as warnings. They interpreted them as signals. Authority was no longer confident enough to remain invisible. It needed to be seen. This mattered. The estate's internal logic had depended on the idea that power was everywhere and nowhere, unquestionable because it was diffuse. Visibility concentrated it. Concentrated power can be measured. Women who had once avoided attention now noted when discipline failed to escalate. Men observed that oversight ebbed and flowed, rather than remaining constant. People began to understand where force could reach, and where it could not. This understanding did not inspire rebellion. It inspired caution of a different kind. The twins felt pressure from outside as well. Neighbors began commenting on the estate's new strictness. Some approved. Others questioned why it had become necessary at all. The sisters recognized the irony. Their restraint had been interpreted as weakness. Their attempt to reassert control was being interpreted as overcorrection. Both interpretations were dangerous. They convened meetings. They revised procedures. They framed discipline as consistency, not reaction. Yet beneath these efforts was a recognition they could no longer ignore. The system was responding to them, not the other way around. Force, when applied without belief, becomes performative. The overseer felt this acutely. Each inspection yielded diminishing returns. People complied, but they did not internalize. Fear no longer preceded action. It followed only when provoked. This inversion eroded efficiency in subtle ways. Tasks took longer. Oversight required more effort. Authority demanded maintenance. And maintenance reveals cost. Among the enslaved population, the lesson was clear. Silence remained valuable, but now so did precision. People spoke less than ever, but their silence was no longer empty. It was deliberate, calibrated, shared. They knew when to comply fully and when to comply minimally. They understood that force could punish action, but struggled to punish restraint. This collective understanding limited what visibility could accomplish. The plantation's attempt to reassert control exposed the boundaries of its power, not dramatically but unmistakably. Force could compel labor. It could not compel belief. Discipline could enforce rules. It could not restore inevitability. The twins faced a narrowing path. Each additional measure of control required greater justification, greater effort, greater visibility. Authority that must explain itself loses something essential. They began to realize that the system they had inherited depended less on violence than on unquestioned acceptance. And acceptance, once withdrawn, could not be forced back into place. By attempting to reclaim absolute control, the plantation had revealed that control had never been absolute at all. It had been sustained by habits, by silence mistaken for consent, by proximity mistaken for necessity, by tradition mistaken for law. Those habits were eroding. And erosion, once begun, rarely stops at the surface. The sisters stood at a threshold they had not intended to reach. Their private choice had altered the estate's equilibrium. Now, the system itself was reacting, straining against limits it had never needed to acknowledge. Force had been applied. Visibility increased. Discipline enforced. Yet something essential had slipped beyond reach. What followed would not be rebellion, not yet. It would be consequence. Because systems unravel not only when challenged from outside, but when those within them stop believing in what they are asked to uphold. Force did what it had always done. It compelled movement. It enforced schedules. It corrected deviation. What it did not do, what it could no longer do, was restore belief. On the Georgia estate, the aftermath of visibility unfolded not as disruption, but as thinning. The plantation did not erupt. It receded. At first, this retreat was almost imperceptible. Tasks were completed, but without surplus. Fields were worked, but without anticipation. The labor force did not slow in ways that could be punished. It slowed in ways that could only be noticed over time. Yield met expectation, but never exceeded it. Initiative disappeared. Adaptation ceased. The system had always depended on unrecorded effort, extra care, quiet problem-solving, invisible endurance. These were never commanded. They were assumed. Now they were withheld. This was not organized refusal. No one announced withdrawal. No one coordinated openly. But the same understanding that had traveled earlier was now being acted upon. Nothing would be given beyond what could be demanded. Force can extract labor. It cannot extract investment. The overseer felt this acutely. Each week required more supervision than the last. Minor disruptions multiplied, not dramatic enough to punish, but frequent enough to exhaust oversight. A tool left unrepaired. A process followed exactly as instructed, even when it clearly failed. The estate became rigid. Rigidity is fragile. The twins watched productivity flatten and could not explain it through discipline or morale. On paper, nothing had changed. In reality, everything essential had withdrawn. This unsettled them more deeply than resistance ever could have. Rebellion presents itself. Withdrawal conceals itself. Among the enslaved population, survival strategies were shifting. People conserved energy. They limited emotional exposure. They did not seek attention, positive or negative. They learned that the safest position was neutrality, not obedience. This neutrality was powerful. It meant fewer conflicts to resolve, fewer opportunities for authority to assert itself meaningfully. The system functioned but without momentum. It endured but without loyalty. Children mirrored this posture. They complied without curiosity. They learned what was required and nothing more. Questions stopped, not because they were answered but because they no longer mattered. The long-term cost of this was invisible in the present. It would appear only later when adaptability was needed. The plantation had begun to hollow out from the inside. The twins, increasingly isolated, faced a paradox. Their attempt to reassert control had succeeded technically. Rules were enforced. Punishments delivered. Authority visible. Yet the estate felt weaker. They sensed it in conversations with neighbors. Comparisons were no longer flattering. Their estate was described as orderly but stiff, reliable but slow. These were not accusations, but they carried implication. In a system built on extraction, efficiency matters. And efficiency was slipping. The sisters debated their response privately. One argued for renewed strictness, more discipline, clearer hierarchy, less tolerance for ambiguity. The other argued for retreat, less oversight, fewer interventions, acceptance of reduced output in exchange for stability. Both understood that neither approach would restore what had been lost, because what had been lost was belief. The enslaved population no longer believed in the inevitability of intrusion. They no longer believed that authority was omnipresent. They no longer believed that silence belonged exclusively to those in power. That belief could not be forced back into place. As months passed, the consequences compounded. Skilled laborers became cautious. Innovation disappeared. Problems that once would have been solved informally now required formal instruction. This burdened management. Force multiplied cost. The overseer began requesting additional resources. More time. More assistance. More justification. Authority was becoming expensive. At the same time, the estate's internal cohesion among the enslaved population strengthened, not in solidarity against the plantation, but in mutual calibration. People learned from one another what was safe to withdraw and what was not. They did not test limits aggressively. They tested them conservatively. Withdrawal spread because it was low risk. No single act could be punished. No leader could be targeted. No ideology could be suppressed. The system could not retaliate against absence. The twins finally recognized the depth of the change when a minor crisis exposed it. A seasonal disruption, weather, supply delay, or illness, created a situation that required flexibility. In previous years, such disruptions had been absorbed through informal cooperation. This time, cooperation did not materialize. Work stopped exactly where instruction ended. No one improvised. No one compensated. The plantation stalled. Not dramatically. Quietly. The sisters intervened directly. They appealed to duty, to tradition, to order. The response was compliance, but only within the narrowest interpretation of instruction. They were forced to confront a reality they could no longer deny. Authority had lost its surplus. Without surplus, systems survive, but they do not thrive. The plantation had not been undermined by rebellion. It had been diminished by disengagement. The sisters' private choice had not liberated the estate. It had destabilized it by revealing that the system relied on more than force. It relied on participation. Participation had been withdrawn. The greatest consequence of exposure was not punishment or unrest. It was erosion. Erosion does not announce itself. It persists. As the year turned, the estate remained intact, but altered. It operated with greater effort for lesser return. Its authority was louder but less effective. its rules clearer but less believed. The twins understood now that the system could not be restored to what it had been, not without reintroducing practices they had already refused, and not without acknowledging what those practices had always concealed. They stood at a final threshold, not between cruelty and restraint, but between collapse and transformation. And they knew that whatever followed would not be contained within their lifetime, because what had withdrawn could not be summoned back, and what had been understood could not be unlearned. What survived when authority let go? The plantation did not collapse. That is the detail history often expects, and often misses. There was no uprising recorded in court documents. No fire, no flight, no single moment that could be named as the end. The Georgia estate continued to exist, to produce, to appear intact to those who viewed it from a distance. But what sustained it had already changed. Long after force had been applied, long after visibility had been increased, long after discipline had been carefully administered, something essential had slipped beyond authority's reach. The system endured. Its certainty did not. This was the plantation's greatest failure, not exposure but survival of something it could not control. The twins remained at the center of the estate, outwardly unchanged in role and position. They continued to manage land, approve accounts, host visitors. From the outside, nothing suggested transformation. Yet privately, they understood that the system they governed was no longer the one they had inherited. Their father's generation had ruled through inevitability. Authority had functioned best when it felt invisible, when it did not need to justify itself. That era had passed. Now, every exercise of control required effort. Every enforcement required explanation. Every rule required reinforcement. Authority had become labor. The twins differed in how they processed this. One framed it as loss, a diminishment of legacy, a weakening of what had been handed down. The other framed it as clarity, an unveiling of truths that had always existed, hidden behind habit. Neither spoke of morality. That language remained dangerous. Instead, they spoke of consequence. What had survived their restraint, and the plantation's response to it, was not rebellion but memory. Among the enslaved population, people remembered the pause. They remembered the period when inevitability had loosened. They remembered learning that silence could be chosen, not just endured. This memory did not disappear when discipline returned. It settled into behavior. Children grew up absorbing this lesson without being taught it directly. They learned not to offer more than was demanded. They learned to conserve themselves. They learned that authority could reach only so far. This was not hope in the abstract sense. It was orientation. Orientation shapes survival. As years passed, the estate's workforce became less expressive, less adaptable, less invested. New overseers struggled where old ones had not. Productivity required more structure, more instruction, more oversight. The plantation had become dependent on mechanisms it once dismissed as unnecessary. It survived, but inefficiently. This inefficiency mattered in a world that was changing beyond its borders. Markets shifted. Politics evolved. New pressures emerged that demanded flexibility. Flexibility, once withdrawn, was difficult to recover. The twins aged. Their authority persisted, but their certainty did not. They understood now that the system had always relied on something more fragile than force. Belief. Belief had fractured. They never spoke publicly of their private choice. They never documented it. History would not record it as cause. But effect lingered. After the twins, the estate passed into other hands. Relatives, trustees, managers who lacked the intimate understanding that had once guided restraint and response. These successors inherited a system already hollowed, already rigid. They misread compliance as loyalty. They misread silence as acceptance. They misread survival as stability. And so they overestimated their control. What they could not see was what had survived beneath compliance. An understanding of boundaries, a calibration of risk, a memory of possibility. This understanding did not lead immediately to change. It did not announce itself as resistance. But it shaped decisions in small, cumulative ways. People conserved energy. They avoided exposure. They waited. When larger forces eventually arrived, economic shifts, political upheaval, legal changes, the estate was unprepared. It lacked the internal cohesion and adaptability required to respond effectively. It did not fall dramatically. It declined. Authority weakened not because it was challenged, but because it was no longer believed in fully. The plantation's greatest failure, then, was not that its practices were exposed, but that its logic was undermined. The logic that claimed certain harms were necessary. The logic that framed restraint as weakness. The logic that mistook silence for consent. That logic did not survive contact with understanding. The twins' private choice did not free anyone in the immediate sense. It did not dismantle the system. But it altered how the system functioned by revealing that alternatives had always existed. That revelation could not be erased. In the end, what survived was not an act, but a lesson. That power depends on participation. That silence can belong to those without authority. That systems endure not because they are absolute, but because they are believed in. When belief falters, even quietly, survival changes shape. The estate continued to stand for years after the twins were gone. Its buildings weathered. Its fields were worked. Its name appeared in records. But it never recovered what it had lost in that quiet period when inevitability cracked. What survived instead was understanding, passed quietly, unevenly, but persistently. And understanding, once learned, does not need permission to endure. It waits.